So, today, in the inaugural episode of our 2024 podcast series, we are delighted to chat with Belizean author, social scientist, and activist, Dr. Dylan Vernon, about his book, Political Clientelism and Democracy in Belize From My Hand to Yours. Now, this book has been touted as the first comprehensive study in decades on a Commonwealth Caribbean state of widespread political clientelism and the damage it does to the body politic and to social democratic principles. So it's pretty heavy. Dylan, welcome. And we're so happy you could chat with us today. Before we get stuck in, please introduce yourself and tell us about the journey that has inspired this incredible book and where folks can find it.
Yes, good afternoon from Belize. Yes, I think your introduction was right on point. How I would describe myself right now is a long-term governance reform advocate and indeed a writer. But I have a long background in working with civil society organizations in Belize from the late 80s into the 90s, part of the 2010s, mostly in political advocacy and I would say, I suppose, general development issues. And I worked with I directed a group called the Society for the Promotion of Education and Research.
Yeah,
back
I remember.
in the 90s. And that was one of Belize's main organizations for political advocacy and popular education. But thereafter, I did some work with the United Nations, UNDP Belize, and yes, I actually did some consulting, started my own business, and then I went back to school, which was, they call it being a mature student, I suppose.
I know it well.
But yeah, I went to do a PhD in 2009, basically to take a break and think about things that were percolating in my head about democracy in Belize. And then I did my thesis on the issue of political clientelism, which then turned into my book. But I had a brief stint, I wouldn't say brief, 7 years after my PhD in 2013 to actually become a diplomat, which was one of my sort of goals when I went to school for the first time. So I was ambassador of Belize to the European Union and about 7 EU states between 2013 and 2020. And I'm back in Belize now, doing consulting, but also writing, researching. I have a blog that I've begun recently, but we're here to talk about my book.
Yeah, this very one.
This very one. The book basically is looking at Belize as a case study of this political phenomena activity that happens in all Commonwealth Caribbean countries. In fact, it happens in most countries.
Just for folks that are not familiar with what it all means, you present Belize as a critical case in the Commonwealth Caribbean of rampant clientelism. Those are your words. What do you mean by political clientelism?
Well, it's a big word academic word, I suppose, that basically means politicians giving resources and services to people in return for political support. That's sort of a more simple definition. In the book, I defined it in a more formal way. And in the book, I define it as an informal and dynamic political exchange between individual or collective clients who provide, and this is important, or promise political support, and patrons, politicians, who provide or promise a variety of targeted and visible resources and favors. Now, that's the sort of more formal definition. But in the Caribbean, we know it as handout politics, patronage politics, rum and roti politics. It's where the game is played around election time mostly, but as my book points out, it is an all air around weekly activity. And as my book shows, compared to the rest of the Commonwealth Caribbean, when I wrote the book, Belize was most likely in the top 2 or 3 of countries in the Commonwealth Caribbean, based upon my own sort of qualitative analysis of the comparisons.
Talk a little bit about what specific conditions would give rise to it generally, and then we'll speak about what did influence it in the case of Belize.
Well, I mean, just before that, I think just to give people an image, on a weekly basis in Belize, you would have Belizeans in constituencies lining up at what is called usually a political clinic for getting something from the politician that they need or want. And it could be a wide range of things, from paying an electricity bill to water bill, money for food or transport, to get a letter of recommendation, to get a scholarship, land, all that sort of thing. But the expectation is that from the politician is that you will vote for me or provide some sort of political support for me as a promise or as an action at some point. But that happens all over the region. I think people can identify with it. But in terms of causes, in the book, I actually go back to pre-independence, and I look at how it began. And in the literature, there are 3 sort of causes or sort of supporting conditions that usually cause political clientelism, and these are having poverty and inequality. Second one is having some dominant control over the allocation of resources. And the third is competitive party politics. Now, pre-independence, Belize had 2 of those. We had and this is true for the rest of the Caribbean, the poverty and inequality was there, the legacy of colonialism. Also, we had the beginnings of electoral politics. Actually, because we got our independence late in 81, it was very developed by the time of independence. But we didn't have the last one totally. That is, the dominant control over the public allocation of resources. So in Belize, by the time we got our independence, we had 2 political parties already competing. And the first political party, the PUP, had begun this practice in small ways. The other political party, the National Independence Party, began to do it to compete. And so by the time we got to independence, there was some introduction to this practice already.
The other interesting concept is the relationship between clientelism and democracy. You say in your introduction to the book that political clientelism is usually seen as lying at the far end of the institutional spectrum from democracy. Now, explain how you define and approach democracy in the book, and expand on the significance of the relationship between democracy and political clientelism.
Sure. No, that's a good way to frame it, because the book is basically, I suppose, about democracy and, in a sense, the backsliding of democracy in Belize. And political clientelism is presented as one of the symptoms of backsliding of democracy in Belize. And so I differentiate in the book very early on. This is very important to me, between what is called formal democracy and what I use in the book, social democracy. And formal democracy is having elections, a body of laws, the institutions that we usually see, the 3 branches of government, and how those work. rights and freedoms. But social democracy gets more into what is democracy for. And generally, it means that democracy should result in more equality and more justice and more sustainable development for a nation. And so in that context, political clientelism is presented as a huge problem for democracy, in that not only does it affect electoral democracy and formal democracy, which we pride ourselves on so much, and we get into that, but it also has a negative effect on social democracy in a variety of ways. That's why it is seen as a huge problem for democracy wherever it is, but especially small developing countries of Belize and the rest of the Caribbean.
You say in your book, it's a universal political phenomenon, and that all countries experience it in some form and to some extent, but it's particularly toxic for a developing democracy. And as you just explained, why Belize got its independence in 1981.
43 years, but yeah.
In terms of sovereign nations, it's a pretty young one. Your book explains how political clientelism shifted across the years from pre to post. And so we're going to get into that discussion a little bit more now and talk specifically about the Belize case. So you said that it began pre-independence, but give us in terms of a timeline. When did you date it?
In the case of Belize, I begin in 1954 when Belize got universal adult suffrage and had its first elections under what would become this Westminster parliamentary model, and where the political party system was beginning. And I go up to independence in September 1981. And I call that phase the innocent phase. And I call it the innocent phase because the kind of political clientelism activities were quite quaint and innocent compared to the rampant things that happened later on. So it's in hindsight, it was innocent. And then I looked at the second phase, I call the bridging phase, from independence to a decade later in 1991, when Belize was just experimenting with being a new nation and having dominant control for the first time over the allocation of resources totally in Belizean hands. So that was the third variable that came into play. And then the last phase would be from 1991 to current. In the book, I stopped at 2013. My research ended. But you had the rampant phase. Yeah, the rampant phase. Yeah.
You also had an epilogue, I think, that took us to 2021 or thereabouts in the book, which
correct.
I think is just as interesting as a rampant phase. So that's really where I'd like to direct the conversation now is to the rampant phase. We've established that pre and just post independence, it was the innocent phase, and then politicians started getting access to resources, and then we began to see what you call a rampant phase. Explain what you mean by that specifically, and then if you could give specific examples of the types of dyadic transactions that you were able to capture in your book, and that allowed political clientelism to really flourish.
In the book, I point for Belize to 1998 as being the pivotal year where political clientelism mushroomed into a more rampant phase. Clearly, it began a bit earlier, but by then, both political parties had been in power at least once. In fact, both had been in power twice. 84, and we had a situation where they both knew that to win an election, one of the things that will help you win is if you can purchase enough votes on the margins to win an election, and both sides began to. It became a cold war, sort of
Yeah.
who can do better than the other. There was this broker who used this analogy. If one side give out chicken, but they see the other side they give out shrimp, then they will start to give out shrimp too, and it's that sort of snowball effect.
Yeah.
But the examples in the context of Belize are many. I mean, I looked at newspaper reports and how they expanded on each major political party accusing the other of buying votes and buying elections. I looked at audit reports. In fact, I start the book with an example of this $20 million that was donated by Venezuela to Belize for what was supposed to be housing development. It had arrived 4 weeks before the 2008 elections or so, and all that money basically was spent by the then PUP government on electioneering, and most of it disappeared. And the audit done by the same government, well, a different party had won, showed that there was no accounting for most of this money. It just went. And that
how is that even allowed? I mean, how can so much money just vanish and that be okay?
Well, it's not okay, but it became so normalized. In fact, no one for that incident in particular went to jail.
Right.
There was no.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
There was total impunity, and that's been the case in Belize for every act of political clientelism. There's been no successful court case, prosecution of any individual politician or voter, because it's illegal in both ways. Because there are laws on the books. The Representation of People Act basically makes it an illegal act. And the last revision after independence, you could give legally an article on the $20 value. I mean, but everybody knows that money is passed. There are things called vacant houses.
It's a lot more than $20. Yeah.
And but the law then goes on to say, to make these things illegal, it has fines of up to 1 year imprisonment for either politicians or voter, and or a fine of $500 or a maximum of $500. But never has it been used effectively, and it is not in the interest of either party to make it happen, for obvious reasons.
See, that's the interesting thing. It's not in the interest of either party, nor do the electorate want anything different. And this is what you point out quite eloquently in the book, that the electorate, it's an expectation, and if you don't do it, then you certainly are not going to win elections. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but before we get to that, I was particularly struck by your assessment of the impact of political clientelism on waste of public finances and loss of revenue, and the evidence that you presented in the book, that it is in fact private money calling the shots. That's how you coached it. You quote one politician as saying, for every dollar financial donors give to politicians, the donors get back double, 10 up to 100 times what is invested. This indirectly means that government revenue is less, and there is less money for the state to meet people's needs. Talk some more about that, Dylan, because that is no small thing. That is a big issue, but it's almost transparent to the process because people are engaged. They're so engaged in this transactional relationships with their politicians that they're not seeing the forest for the trees. What do you say?
Well, I mean, first of all, not not the entire electorate is playing the game. I mean, in my book, I make a conservative estimate of about 20 to 25% of the electorate playing the game. And I think conservative is a key word there, because it's most likely it's much more than that.
Yeah.
But that percent is 1/4 of the electorate, more or less. And in a constituency, in a very small country where elections can be won by dozens of votes or 100 votes, it makes a difference. I mean, that's key. But to your question, the waste is one of the things that, for me, is the most important to focus on. And maybe we make the link by asking, where does the money come from for politicians to be spending in these clinics on a weekly basis that can add up quite easily over the course of a 5-year period to millions of dollars? I mean, where does it come from? And very few politicians use their own money. I mean, they've gotten
Of course.
it's not pre-independence anymore. So it either comes from private sources, and a lot of it does. And we know the game of quid pro quo, especially if you're a very big donor. And the other side would be public resources. But if you focus on the private side of it, the examples in Belize are many, but few are more known than what is called by Victor Bulmer Thomas the Ashcroft effect. And Lord Michael Ashcroft has played a major role in being a major donor to both political parties. Everyone knows this in Belize. And it doesn't take Columbus to discover that some of that money and all of the other funds that come from private donors will end up in the political clinic. Some will end up in the politician's pocket, perhaps, but some will end up in that clinic, because for the politician, the most important thing is to win that next election. And these clinics are going to be the weekly clinics are going to be the main way to do it. And of course, on election day, when it becomes more blatant, to actually give out cash and other things to people. So if some of that money goes to the clinics, then the connection is made to why I think I'm saying in the book that these private donors have so much influence, because they get back something in return. In the case of Michael Ashcroft, he became ambassador of Belize to the United Nations.
Yes.
He basically have had his lawyers write several laws. Again, these things are factual. They've been reported on. And while it's difficult to make the exact link between money given and what someone gets, you can put one and one together, and you can see, there is a problem. But the waste happens when the revenues that are supposed to be coming in, when tax breaks are given, for example, to Lord Ashcroft, when agreements are made with donors that you are going to be able to get duty-free on this particular item or not, we lose revenue. And then on the other hand, when we go to the public resources side of it, we have where politicians try to use every way possible to get some public resource, be it funds in their constituencies, scholarships, land, social welfare funds, they try to get control over that to make decisions as to who gets it.
Right.
And that results again in waste, because it's not because of merit. There's double dipping, triple dipping, and the institutions are supposed to be doing these things then become weakened. And
Right.
that's a big problem within the public service.
And do you think over time that is deliberate, the weakening of the institutions?
I don't know if it is intentional. I think that politicians, the ones I interviewed, understood the impact. It's not that they didn't understand the impact, but
Right.
they would even say that, yeah, I understand that this game that is being played has negative consequences, but I have to do it because that's the only way I can win the election. It is like, and then they excuse it by saying at the end of the day, people are benefiting. We're helping people. We're helping people. And as you were saying a while back, some of that is true. Some people are benefiting. There's this informal welfare system happening, ran by the politicians. And when that happens, not only do the formal institutions that are supposed to do it get weakened, but the solutions are short term.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
the politicians think about the next election, which is less than 5 years away.
Excellent segue into what I want to talk about next, and that is the public policy issue that we have, right? In the case of Belize, you say that, the more damaging impact of entrenched clientelism on the policymaking process lies in the financing demands for ongoing and growing costs of the clientelist operations of politicians, because it promotes short-term and individually targeted approaches to problem solving. And it disincentivizes effort towards long-term planning for national programs, which is exactly, what you were just saying. We can only see until the next election cycle. We can't see that we have bigger problems that we need to take on board. Talk a little bit more about that.
No, the short-termism that it promotes.
Yeah.
Remember, it was already there to some extent, because politicians think in 5-year sort of terms, but it's there even more so because if you believe that you have to, as a politician, service your constituents as much as you can, every week you're looking for funds to make sure you can do that. So sometimes it's not even like 5 years. It is what will happen in the next month.
Wow.
And to me, a good example is that we have a situation now where the political party's manifesto becomes the development plan for the country in a 5-year period. And both parties have done it. I mean, if you didn't know what the Blue Manifesto was in Belize, you know by now. But it is what is used even by international agencies now as the National Development Plan of Belize. Yeah. But it's a party's manifesto. It's a short-term plan to win an election.
But wait, Dylan, don't we have a national development plan? A real life one?
Not
Horizon 2030, something so?
No, well, that one way back was done, but when this new government won, as far as I know, that's where it ended, and the Blue Manifesto became the sort of plan for the nation. Yeah. But in the book, I give several examples of this short-term approach. But the major point I was making that, for example, if you're looking at, say, land reform, you are not going to want to change a system in which the minister has ultimate discretionary powers over distributing lands. Right now, we have a situation where somebody was asking the other day, I remember, on the radio. So who owns what in Belize? We know that we have so much land in public land, so much private land and reserve land, but actually who owns all this land? It's hard to answer that question because
Yeah.
it's not in the interests of both political parties over time to do a real land study and say, okay, this
Correct.
is what the situation is, and this informs policy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the policies are not done for a long-term basis. There's also especially a disincentive for long-term, anything that would sort of stop or mitigate the ability for politicians to do political clientelism well. For example, both parties have promised campaign finance regulation for since 30
Yeah.
years ago. No one has done it yet. That one will go to the heart of the
Yeah.
problem of
Exactly.
putting transparency and light on where the money comes from in terms of private money. And so I don't expect action on that one right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence is there to support that that's not going to happen anytime soon. In the book, you establish the linkages as well between clientelism and corruption. And you argue that, that there's a clear and direct relationship between an increase in political corruption and rampant clientelism in Belize, and that it plays a significant role in promoting the acceptance of corruption among the wider Belizean public. Expand on that a little.
Yeah. No, the political clientelism and the political corruption are like first cousins. The overlap between them is basically, again, answering the question of where the money comes from.
Yeah.
And if it comes from public sources, and I mean, political corruption is basically abusing your public authority or public resources for private gain, and the private gain can be for either the politician, him or herself, or their voter. And so when public funds are used, for example, Christmas handouts, Easter handouts, and I think it averages like 1.5 to 2 million that is divided among all the constituencies to give out treats for obvious reasons, because the politician gets personal benefit. That money, if you compare it to what a department of government gets, can be bigger than the budget of some small departments. And so that goes to waste. But who benefits from it in a private way would be the politician and the voter. There's that, but when the money comes from private sources, it's even worse, because we have the quid pro quo of the bloated contracts, the waste that happens, but the private gain there is both for the politician and for the donor. The example that I put in the epilogue of John Saldivar, the former Minister of National Security, who had tried to become leader of the United Democratic Party in 2020, is instructive, because for the first time you sort of got a glimpse into how the system works. He was basically receiving some funds, which he calls donations to his campaign from an international source, and he eventually, as I think you know, was designated by the U.S. State Department as a person involved in corruption, and his visa was revoked, etc. But the only reason we got a glimpse into that was because there was this court case happening in the U.S. But basically shows the great risk to which a politician will go into
Mm-hmm.
to, as he also said, to assist his constituents. That was his sort of, this is what everybody does, and he's right. But he's one of the few that we have seen some evidence of because of this court case.
But the interesting thing about those examples is that it's less painful or better for the politician to come when they're caught red-handed like that, to say, well, I was doing it for the people. You have no way of knowing whether he pocketed all that money or he actually gave it to the to his constituents. But it's a more palatable explanation if you were to say, well, I did it because this is in service to my constituents, which is, it's madness, because the result is almost the same. But yeah,
and in service to my constituents, which is almost like the helping the people, and all the way from George Price up to now,
right.
basically translates into buying political support, buying votes. And I use the word political support because I think that sometimes we focus too much on the election. Election time is when the money is being distributed more blatantly. But as I said at the beginning, it happens every week, every day. And one politician told me that by the time election rolls around, the politician already has spent most of what he needs to spend before the campaign even begins.
Wow.
From these weekly claims. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's no surprise then that you also found linkages to violence and the drug trade, and all of that. And I wish we had more time to delve into it. You say that what exists now is an entrenched welfare system, and the politicians that win elections have the better clientelist machinery, pure and simple, with the express and explicit consent of those who benefit from it. And you pointed out, it's not all the electorate, but certainly around 25, maybe a little bit higher, to 30% of it. You quote a politician as saying, if we don't stop the practice of clientelism, we will end up a failed state. I mean, this is horrifying to me. And
like
the thing
knowing the problem and accepting that you can do nothing about it.
Exactly. Except that you also point out that if we continue along this route, we'll begin to see diminishing returns. And the interesting thing to me is that, the world right now is facing several urgent challenges, and climate change is perhaps the challenge of our time. And it requires accountability, a fiscal space that's not weakened by corruption and clientelism, objective decision-making and unbiased enforcement of regulations that ensures against, actions that could result in environmental damage and overuse of resources, etc. My point is this: you've aptly laid out the corruption risk and the corresponding democratic decay that entrenched political clientelism has and continues to levy, on Belize. But at the same time, Belize is vulnerable. It's a vulnerable, low-lying country for which climate change is an existential threat. In this context, Dylan, it would seem business as usual will most certainly lead to our demise. Where, in your opinion, do we go from here? What do we do next? Can we arrest this trajectory, in your opinion?
In addition to the challenges that you mentioned that I wrote about, there was the question from the broker that I quoted. The broker is the in-between between the politician and the client. If we get rid of it, what will replace it?
Yes.
And from that point and from that angle, clearly there needs to be a decrease in poverty and inequality, because that's one of the main drivers. That's long term. So the issue of the competition between the two parties, maybe we can do something there in terms of how we do elections. That is, we're not talking about political reform. And the dominant control over the allocation of resources, again, it goes back to how the political system works. And so I think that legislative and regulatory solutions are there to for trying at least. It will take and perhaps a revolution, as I said in one of my recent blog pieces, for this to happen.
Yeah.
But I do think that these things have to be tried, and for that we need this critical mass of people forcing the politicians to change, or else they will not unilaterally disarm their clientelist machines, because one won't do it if the other keeps doing it.
Correct.
And
And how likely is it that we're going to achieve critical mass in the next 5 years?
Unlikely.
Yeah.
Well, and when I say diminishing returns too, I think what I meant more by that was that the acts of political clientelism get so sort of, it caused so many problems for a government that it is one of the factors that makes it lose the next election.
Yes.
Because parties lose elections in Belize by having too much corruption that's linked to clientelism, messing up the economy, etc. But the other party is just waiting there to come and do the same thing.
Correct.
And so the cycle continues, but political clientelism will result in a party becoming less popular eventually, because the other side will find a way to outspend it. And they will have a bad image because of the problems that it causes. I don't mean to sound pessimistic in the book, but I do. Maybe I will end with one example that made me even a bit more pessimistic. When Hurricane Lisa happened 2 years ago, year and a half ago, for the first time since I've heard about hurricane relief, the government decided not to use NEMO or the Red Cross, but the hurricane relief funds were given directly to the representatives in the areas for them to distribute themselves. And it's happening more and more. So it's going in the other direction, where it's becoming even worse. And I think the book attempts to tie the dots together.
I need a sip of wine on that one.
So that people become more aware of the problems that it causes, and that we have reached a critical saturation point, and if we don't do anything at all, this thing can really result in perhaps causing us to be more of a failed state.
A failed state. Yeah. I know that you continue exploratory work on the appropriate responses. You're well known for your constitutional reform advocacy. We would need several episodes to appropriately interrogate the issues and really to do it justice. But before we close, Dylan, could you give us an idea of what specific measures you consider most important if the opportunity presents itself for things to shift?
Yeah. I think I would say 3 things right off. One is change the way we appoint ministers to cabinet, so that the cabinet is never the majority in the House. That is, we have to have a decentralized system where the House actually has oversight over the executive. That is not the case, because we have these small parliaments, and that it centralizes power and make it easy for politicians to use public resources for clientelism. The second one is reform the electoral system, make voter bribery not only illegal, but make sure that those who were involved in it are caught and punished more.
How do you enforce that? I think the issue is not the law, right? The issue would be the actual enforcing the law against voter bribery.
That's partly true. I mean, the law can do with some changes. The Election and Boundaries Commission is supposed to oversee the implementation of some of these laws, but the political parties control the Election and Boundaries Commission. Perhaps that can change, where
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
not controlled by political parties, but by civil society, nonpartisan representatives, and then that aspect of the law can come under more scrutiny. And
Yeah.
the other thing, perhaps, would be, as we said a while ago, campaign finance reform. That elusive, or regulation, I should say, that elusive promise that both political parties have made, where because you have to declare what you get as a political party or a private candidate, political candidate, where the money comes from, that could be a disincentive to, especially if there are
Right.
limits,
Right.
to having this sort of differentiation between the political parties.
Right. It's such
But
a huge undertaking that you just
it's
don't
huge
know where
undertaking.
to begin. But, you know, it's urgent as well. It's
Yeah.
urgent. Reform is absolutely necessary, isn't it? Hopefully we get to do this several more times. The essays that you've written, I mean, you've discussed some very interesting proposals that I think we could, you know, I'd love to interrogate a little bit more. But for now, Dylan, I have to say thank you very, very much for the very scintillating conversation and for your amazing work. Really salute you. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me. You know, these are issues that I think we just need to have as much discussion around the issue as possible. So again, thanks. And I look forward to continuing our conversations around your ongoing work. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me, and the book.
Yeah.
You can get it on Amazon. It's actually discounted right now, and urge you to get it. In Belize, you can get it at Brody's on the
Yep.
Northern Highway.
That's where I got mine, at Brody's on the Northern Highway. I really encourage everyone to read it. Thanks again, and we'll do this again another time.
Okay. Cheers.
To the folks who are listening, if you're hearing this message, you've successfully made it to the end. So thank you for that. Until next time, stay well. And remember, there's always a place for fierce kindness and gratitude. Thanks again, Dylan. Until next time.
Thank you, Celine.